Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Where Knowledge Stems From. In today's episode, my guest is Dr. Martha Mullally. Dr. Martha Mullally received her PhD from the University of Ottawa. She then did her postdoc with the Carl Weinman Science Education Initiative. In this episode, we discuss the different paths that Dr. Martha Mullally took in order to be the faculty member at Carleton University that she is today. She teaches several different courses, such as Year 2 and Year 4 biotechnology, as well as microbiology and plants form and function. Dr. Martha goes into detail about her learning methods, her teaching, her experience, and how the different paths she took led to her being the professor that she is today. So please join me for another great episode with Dr. Martha Mullally. Enjoy. Dr. Martha Mullally, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining. So I'd like to start by asking you what got you into science. So you're a great professor. You have a unique approach to teaching, and I'd like us to get into that because for starters, can you tell us a bit about your journey? When did you find out that wanting to be a professor was your calling, and how was your division between going from undergrad to your graduate degree studies?
Okay. Well, I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada. I did my first degree at Dalhousie in biochemistry, but my very first degree, and this is kind of a theme for me, I had a double major because it's really hard for me to choose a major. So it was a degree in biochemistry and psychology, and mainly I've always been really interested in drugs, which is, lots of biochemistry is drugs, but
the development of them or how the drugs work on the human body?
How drugs work inside human bodies. That was a big driving interest. And then also genetics. I love genetics, and I went to university in the 90s. It was a really exciting time in genetics. And I was really excited about the developments and all sorts of new ways of understanding. And it was definitely a big motivator for me. And I finished my undergraduate degree, and then my first job was at a genetics education center. So it actually was the educational branch of the Cold Spring Harbor Lab. And the Cold Spring Harbor Lab, which is in a little place called Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island, just an hour east of New York City. It has been a center for biological research, in some ways infamously, but in lots of ways importantly, for more than 100 years. So it was a really famous place. And it was kind of fluky, sort of how I got the job. But I knew I wanted to do something in science and education. And again, it was the 90s, I sent out paper letters and copies of my resume to multiple institutions across North America, mostly science museum type places. And two of those places wrote back to me. And one of them was the Cold Spring Harbor Lab. So I went there and worked for a couple of years, and I was really interested in teaching and education, I thought. And then I came back to Canada, did a degree in education, and I worked for a short time as a high school teacher. And it wasn't a great fit for me. I think there's a few things, there was a lot, it was hard to get a job in the 90s. So once I got a job, I worked in this one high school. I taught grade 10 science and grade 10 math. I can teach math if you really need me to, but that's just not something I get excited about getting out of bed in the morning for sure. And I do think the social component of the work was too much for me. Emotionally, I found it really hard. A lot of kids with a lot of needs, and they're actually legally, they're children. And I found that hard to be exposed to.
What classes were you teaching at the time?
Grade 10 remedial math.
Right.
So in Ontario, you have to pass that course to pass high school.
Okay. Math course.
Yeah.
Right.
So imagine the really keen learners.
Yeah.
repeat customers, a lot of apathy and defensiveness in the room, right? A lot of fear and insecurity. I learned so much from that group of kids. I probably, some of the most intense learning I've ever received. It was hard. It was so hard. But at the end of the semester, they laid me off and I went home discouraged, and I just thought, like, I can't seem to get a foothold into this world. And it was my husband who he said, what about grad school?
Right. So you hadn't done any grad school at that point?
No, I hadn't really thought about grad school. When I worked at Cold Spring Harbor, the only people who were my friends were postdocs, for the most part. And it just looked really hard. You know, these are like really, really smart people, like, you know, PhD from Harvard, PhD from Yale, and they're doing their postdoc at Cold Spring Harbor. And they just like work their tails off, never sleep, in the lab at all hours. And so I have to say, they didn't make science look fun. And so I wasn't really sure about it for me. But when I lost my job as a high school teacher, I started sort of coming. I went to talk to a few people at U of O. I talked to someone at Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and I came to Carleton.
Okay.
To talk to somebody who did work in plant genetics. Because we had lived in a house in Halifax with a really big sunny window. And because I was underemployed, I started growing plants. And I grew a garden for the first time. And I started really loving plants. And so I met this woman who was a prof here in the Carleton Biology Department, Sharon Regan. And Sharon and I just hit it off. Like, we were both from similar places. Where she's from New Brunswick and I was from Nova Scotia. And we really, really liked each other and got along really well. So I did a master's degree with Sharon.
Out of curiosity, just to take a step back, what happened at the time when you were in Long Island doing the lab? How long did you stay there? And was it because you saw how everybody was doing the research, as you were mentioning, that maybe discouraged you from wanting to continue in R&D?
So I loved my job, which was like teaching little kids. We taught children like between grade 4 and 7 or something. They were quite little, with like little lab benches and little labs. It was so cute. It was all so cute. It was so fun. We went into the schools all over Long Island and New York City to do workshops with kids. It was so much fun.
Awesome. Yeah.
I loved that job. But we regularly had postdocs come and teach the high school kids. We would have like little kids and high school kids. And sometimes those postdocs were coming because they didn't have any teaching experience. They wanted to get a little bit of teaching experience. And it's terrible to say, but a lot of them were really downers. They were so... The stakes are really high in a place like that. People working really, really hard and taking themselves and the work really seriously, which is all fine. But yeah, it didn't look fun. That's for sure. And it never occurred to me that like, oh yeah, I should be one of those people.
I'm actually curious about, you said that you had sent out your resume and it was paper-based format at the time. How did you find that job all the way out in New York? Yeah.
I know. It's funny because, so I graduated from university in 1998. And it was still like pretty early days of the internet, right? So they had a website. Almost all of these places had a website, but it was very static, just like, you know, a picture. I remember the place where I worked, they had a drawing of the center. Okay. Like a nice artistic drawing, and then text. That was it. And like no hyperlinks, no who works here, nothing like this. So I just found places that looked interesting and I sent them this package. And the guy who was the head, the center I worked was called the DNA Learning Center. The guy who was the head of the DNA Learning Center, he found my application kind of curious and called me on the phone because 1998.
Right.
And he said, send us something that will impress us. That's all he said.
And you sent them your resume?
No. And then that was my assignment, send them something to impress them. I went to Kinko's.
What is that?
Again, so 90s. It was like a copy center, but it also had like standalone computers with design software. So you could buy like an hour or 2 hours of time on the computer and use fancy software that didn't exist, like that I would never have had access to anywhere else. And that's what I did. And I think the Kinko was open 24 hours. I stayed there like all night long. I learned like enough of the rudimentary. It's kind of like using like Photoshop or Illustrator or something like that.
Right, back in the day.
Yeah, back in the day.
Yeah.
So it was pretty simple because if it had been complicated, I wouldn't have been able to figure it out. But I figured it out and made this booklet that it described me. Like, I'm from here and this is what I've studied and these are the cool things I've done and this is why you should hire me. And it was in color and it was multiple pages. And I sent that in the mail.
Wow,
I put it in the mail.
That's like a 90s version of a portfolio, right? Yes. Yeah. That's awesome because you did that.
Isn't that wild? Yeah. I had worked for 2 summers in my undergrad. I worked in a biotech company. And so a chunk of my booklet was about working in that company and developing this test. It's like a lateral flow test assay with urine to test for some important metabolic markers. So I included that, and I included a little bit about where I was from, which even that I had found them seemed weird to them, right? Because I seemed weird. Like I was from a place they'd never heard of. Like, again.
So they were also impressed by that, probably.
They're just like, what the hell how did she find us?
Yeah.
And so then I went to New York for the interview and I started working that summer.
Okay. And how long were you there for?
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah. It was a really wild, fun place to work. It was so creative and we were trying to find ways to make the science really accessible. And because the people who are like in the group that I worked in, we only worked with little children, right? So we're always trying to make it more accessible, more concrete, more well-described. And so we would develop like worksheets and booklets. And since I was like a design person,
right.
Yeah. I'd like turn myself into this person. Yeah, we had there was a lot of money in that organization. So anything we wanted, we would just order. And then, like at the time, a lot of classrooms didn't have projectors. So we just brought our own projectors.
Okay.
We just bring the projector and the computer and a pile of microscopes and like have little kids look at fruit flies for an hour and a half and talk about mutations and phenotype and genotype, that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was a super, super fun place to work. I had such a good time.
Why did you leave then?
Oh, really very personal reasons.
Okay, you don't have to get into that.
I had a boyfriend who lived in Ottawa.
Okay, fair enough. I understand that.
Yeah.
And then, so you moved to Ottawa, and then you started to teach as a high school teacher for a while?
Then I did a degree in education.
Right. Which actually I want to get into that a little bit, comparing high school teachers or really just grade 1 to 12 teachers that have to get educational degrees compared to professors teaching at a higher level education and don't have to do that. So we'll get to that in a minute, but I'll let you continue explaining. Yeah,
so I did that degree. I liked it a lot. I had a lot of fun. And then I taught we moved to Halifax for a short time, then we moved back to Ottawa, and I worked in both Halifax and Ottawa. And at that time, this is now like into the early 2000s, it was quite hard in Nova Scotia. It was impossible to get a job as a public school teacher. And so we moved back to Ottawa, and I did get the job, but they had this policy, and it's pretty common in a unionized environment, that if there are cuts, the last person in is the first person out. So I worked in a high school. There are 5 of us in like the science office. And in June, 3 of us were laid off.
Okay.
And by then, my undergraduate degree was almost 5 years old. And when I started to think about grad school, I started to think like, I'm going to have to go soon. Otherwise, it will look like I've been kind of out of school for too long. And maybe I'd have to like upgrade or something like this. So I applied to Carleton, of all places, and I did a master's degree in Arabidopsis genetics with Sharon Regan.
Awesome. All right. And then that was 2 years. Did you fast track or did you get?
No. I was here. Well, I was actually like here for the first year. And then Sharon she went to Queen's. She's faculty at Queen's now. And I went with her for the second year. But I think must have been in that first year. I needed to take a course and there weren't a lot of courses, right? Which is kind of a general problem. So there was this course in ethnopharmacology, ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology. And I literally had to Google the words. I had no idea what these words meant. Ethnobotany is like the study of how humans use plants, and ethnopharmacology is the study of how humans develop drugs. So I went to University of Ottawa and I took that course with Thor Arneson, and the course just blew my mind. I just never had an experience in university like that where I could not believe that people could sit around or have entire careers where all they would be interested in is how humans use plants. It blew my mind. I loved it so much. I wrote a big paper for his course, and I'd never had the experience of like enjoying every minute of writing the paper. I had just never experienced that before. So that was probably the moment that like, in a lot of ways, it was taking that course that changed the trajectory of my life, because I was like pretty practical. I was almost 30. I thought, PhD, that's a really long road. I'm not sure that's the road I want. But I was able to get an NSERC to do my PhD, and I went to visit Thor, and he was really open to me joining his group. And so I was really, really excited, and I joined his group, and I did a PhD in the use of a group of plants to treat anxiety, or to look at anxiety-like behavior in animals, but with the goal of understanding anxiety in humans. And that's what I did my PhD in.
That's awesome, actually. What was the outcome of your PhD there? Did you learn that there are specific plants that you can use that would?
Yeah, the group had identified this very, very special group. It's a really, really, really small plant family that lives in the tropics, neotropics. So like Costa Rica and Belize is the 2 main places where it was identified, but it's also can be found in the Amazon. And Thor's group had like, they were like pretty far down the road in terms of identifying like this plant definitely works in animal models. And then I spent most of my PhD trying to figure out how. So what does it, where does it act, and what does it do, and how does it get metabolized? And we were able to characterize the mechanism and the major bioactive molecule in the plant. And Thor had a really multidisciplinary way of training grad students. So I spent time in the biology lab. I spent time in experimental psych lab in the Royal Ottawa Hospital. And I spent time in a chemistry lab. And I, not everybody has like a wonderful experience at grad school, but I genuinely did. I loved grad school.
I'm sure this question might be on other people's minds. What was the plant? I don't think it's the one that I'm thinking about.
The plant's name is Cerubius sympetala. a vine. What is the word I'm looking for? It's a vine that climbs up other trees. It's not a common plant. There's a famous ethnobotanist, well, really more like plant biochemist that Thor had done his PhD with, who is the first person. Is that right? I think that one of the first people in any of the North American literature to identify anything about that plant. But it shows up in a famous set of writings by an ethnobotanist at Harvard who, it's funny, I haven't thought about this stuff for a long time. Anyway, the guy at Harvard, he had written several books, and his famous book is about plants of the Amazon. And it shows up in there, but there's 3 sentences. There's not very much. And a chunk of Thor's work was very collaborative work with Indigenous people. He had long-standing collaboration with the Maya and Belize. And a previous student had done work essentially about plants used to treat nervous system disorders. And she identified, through interviews with people and collecting and talking, she identified this group of plants. So I worked on one of those, a Piper amide, but the Cerubia plant kind of stood out that it had activity, more impactful activity than had been observed with other kinds of plants.
Do you remember what the mechanism was?
Yeah. This the cool thing about the mechanism. In some ways, it's cool. It's cool because it does something that you would expect. In some ways, that's maybe less cool because maybe it would have been cool to find something really unexpected. But in our brains, on our neurons, we have this group of receptors called the GABA receptors. GABA receptors mediate a lot of our sort of neurodrug interactions. So ethanol, for example, binds to the GABA receptor and mediates how ethanol interacts with the brain. A lot of drugs interact with that receptor, and we showed that the active molecule in the plant interacted directly with that receptor as well. The cool thing about it is that mechanism is well described, right? So it's not surprising because it's a receptor that binds lots of things, so that's not super surprising. And then in some ways, it's nice to say, okay, well, this well-known mechanism, and we can show that there's a new molecule, a new kind of interaction that happens at the pre-described receptor.
And I think that was gamma aminobutyric acid, for those that are interested in looking it up.
Oh yeah. But the receptor itself it's the GABA receptor. But yeah, it's GABA is one of the things that binds to the receptor. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that do as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then after you finish your PhD, you hadn't become more interested in getting into research, because since your path ended up in becoming a professor, I imagine there was a defining point that you thought, I want to become a professor.
It looks like I wanted to be a professor, but I didn't.
Okay. So how did it happen?
So I wanted to work in industry.
Right.
I felt like it was too risky to only want to be an academic, and that it would make sense to have like a variety of possible skills. So what I thought was really cool about the natural health product world is that there's like a whole directorate that's part of Health Canada that's focused on natural health products. And many people who graduated out of Thor's group went to work there. So I thought that would be a place where I could work. All the way through my PhD, we had a collaboration with a small biotech company. And I thought I would go and work for them. But then they went bankrupt.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Which is kind of part of the story of Canadian biotech. And yeah, I didn't really think about being an academic. What happened was I was doing like a very short postdoc, mainly is like repeating some experiments that we had done as part of my PhD. And it was just an assay that worked really well. And we wanted to continue screening drugs in this assay. So I was continuing to do that. And I had my second baby. My daughter was born I wasn't really sure what I would do after she was born. And a friend of mine was doing a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, a friend who I met at Carleton. We were in the same lab group at Carleton.
During your master's?
Yeah.
Nice.
And she came for dinner at Christmas, and she was telling me about her postdoc. She just was loving it. She thought it was just amazing. She has a PhD in plant genetics, so it's like a similar background to me. And then she spent some time in industry, and she just didn't find it satisfactory, didn't find it fun. And this postdoc had like really kind of given her life and enthusiasm back, which was really cool. And she's telling me about how great it was. And she said, like, I could really see you in this group. I think that it would be a really good fit. And I was like, I don't know about that. I just had another baby. We had our 4-year-old. I had our son who was 4.5 at the time. I just felt like I had a lot going on, just in terms of our family, and this postdoc was at UBC. So we had a great conversation, and I was excited for her that she was so enthusiastic. And then a couple months later, she sent me a job posting, and she said, look, like, they're looking for another person. And I know it's a long shot for you to come to BC, but I think you should come out for an interview. And so I did. I went for the interview, and it was a really big project. It was this big, like, redesigning of their first year biology course project. Their course has 2,000 students, and they teach it in 10 sections. So they have 8 people, 8 different instructors who teach the course. They teach it, what was it? It was multiple courses in the fall, multiple courses through the winter, and then one section in the spring. So they have all these 8 people on the team, and then they have like grad student TAs and undergraduate student TAs who are also part of this like redesign the course team. And they wanted 2 postdocs on this team. And it was this like faculty style interview process where I gave 1 or 2 talks. I met everybody on the project. And then in the second day, I went to a journal club of the people who were part of the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative. And those people were sitting around just talking about teaching. And I just loved it. And I just came home and I was like, I want to go and be with those people. I want to be part of that whole thing that they're doing. And so that was probably the first time I started thinking like, oh, maybe I want to stay in the university. And that was just a wonderful experience being at UBC and being part of that project. And then I had a really unique set of qualifications. So I had, my PhD in biology, but now I had this like special, different way of thinking about teaching and sort of critical lens on undergraduate education. And that helped me to get my first faculty position, which was a contract position at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Yeah. And that was a good experience, but it wasn't a permanent job. And while I was there, Carleton posted a permanent job, and they wanted a plant biology person with experience in biotech who mainly was going to teach. And I was
check.
That's me. And I remember saying that one of the first questions was, why did you apply for this job? Now I know. I really think a better answer to that question is like, I love Carleton, because we always want to hear someone say like, I love Carleton. I want to be part of your community. But what my answer was that you have described me in the job description, and I don't think you can find a better person for the job. I was so excited about the job, and I was so excited about how the alignment between my experience, my interests, and the job description.
Then you got that job for sure. And
I did.
You moved back to Ottawa. Mm-hmm. And how was it like settling in at the time?
It was good. Yeah. The biology department at Carleton is a really special place. It's full of like caring, smart, committed people who were helpful and people who would answer all of my questions. And, you know, it was stressful at first because I was trying to figure out how to do the job, but it was only just stressful because you have to like make up things to teach all the time. I've always really liked it here, like from the beginning. And one of the best things that happened really was Root Gorlick. At the time, he taught plant form and function, and Root became the president of the faculty union. And so I was here for like a month or so when the chair at the time came to me and said, "Could you teach plant form and function?" And I said, "Yeah, I could." And he's like, "Well, because Root needs teaching release and we need someone else to teach the course." And I've always really loved being able to teach the plants course. And then I even say to my colleagues who do research on plants, like, I think there's a role for me to be an ambassador for the discipline. Just say to people like, welcome to how cool and amazing plants are. And you can learn that with me, and then you can go to someone's lab and more fully explore that.
When I was in your first biotech course, when I first met you, you had that approach to learning, which was very unique. So had you developed that as you were teaching, or did you come in with that?
I came in with that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because I had learned so much in my postdoc about learning is an active thing. You have to do the learning, and doing it is exactly what happens in that biotech class, right? Where we look at some information or some ideas, and then we try to apply, answer a question, or interpret graph. But that class, I got super excited about using case studies, because what's so cool about biotech is the science is really interesting, right? And that, of course, I always love the science, but there's all of these other components where the science interfaces with culture, with law, with questions of bioethics. And I think that when you're 19 and 20, like, you know, second year part of your degree, it's a really exciting time to grapple with hard questions like that, right? Like, is it ethical? Is it reasonable? Did the scientists overstep? Could they have predicted that this is how the science would have been used? All of those kinds of things. And so I designed the course that we would do some like learning the main ideas in one hour or so. Now it's an hour and a half every week, and then spend the 2 hours like really working hard together on a case study. And it just makes it really fun, and it makes it really interesting and topical. And I think it also means that students hone some skills that are really valuable, transferable skills, like, you know, making an argument, discussing respectfully, like disagreeing respectfully. You know, sometimes they talk about that in that class, right? Yeah. Like, this is a controversial topic, or this might hit closer for you than for some of your peers, but it's really important that you disagree if you want to, but find ways to disagree respectfully and kindly with each other. And then also see how the science is out in the world. And so that particular class is a really good example of, I think, how active learning should happen in a course.
To go into that a bit in more detail, to give a background about how I mostly would learn stuff from lecturers or professors. You know, you go to a class, it's an auditorium with 300-400 seats. There's a lecturer on the board. They're mostly talking by themselves throughout the whole thing. And I mean, people are sitting there. It's easy to get distracted. I would often see people, you know, on Amazon or on some sort of website, not really paying attention to the professor. And it's very easy to lose track of paying attention in your lecture. And then, you know, come the exam, if there's something not on the slides, you will not know it, and you will most certainly answer the question wrong. Now, what you were doing is you had 2 different lecture times during the week. The first time was maybe an hour, hour and a half, and that was scheduled in a way where you give maybe a 10-15 minute talk, and you have a worksheet. And that worksheet, we have to talk amongst ourselves to try to figure out what the problem is, what the solution is, and then you lecture us about something different. But keeping that short amount of lecturing time is easier for people to not lose focus, because they know that I only have to pay attention for 10, 15 minutes and then I get back to the worksheet. And then when you move into the longer form in the next part of the week, in the next half of the week, it's now not an auditorium base, or there were mostly small rooms, but now we're back to these larger rooms that have round tables. So you have different groups. You give us these case studies and we have to work together to solve those problems. So can you take us into how you constructed the case studies and what came about doing those in the first place?
So some of those case studies I made up, or, based on something in the world. Some of them I used because there are a couple of databases of peer-reviewed case studies, which is the best. I love it. Makes it really, really easy. So sometimes I can think of one I had made up. I developed one about patenting human genes, because in class we talk about patents. We talk about very positively, like you want to protect your IP and patents one way to do it. And then without giving a lot of context, which I think is kind of fun.
Yeah.
Just like, boom, information that's really biased. I would give one group of students information from the company's perspective, a group of students information from a patient's perspective, a group of students who their perspective was like cancer researchers. And each group got totally biased information. And then at first, they answered questions just based on the information they had. And then they worked in groups with people from each of the other perspectives. And then they find out that the situation is quite a bit more complex. And I always have students in that activity who don't want to keep the company's perspective. They'll start to say, like, I don't want to argue that we should patent genes. And I'll say, no, you have to. You have to keep that opinion until later. Later you can have your own opinion. So I developed that one. But the idea basically for all of them is to leverage the peer instruction, right? So if I learn about something, sometimes I'll get students to learn something before they come to class and then be ready to teach others. Or we did a case study last year where it was a paper about a nanobody to the development of a nanobody to treat SARS-CoV-2, so COVID. The paper is really complex, and there are 4 main techniques that were used in the paper. And then I had small groups of students learn each technique. So like, what is a nanobody? That's the technique that they learn. And then they teach it to the whole room. So you practice like trying to make sense of things for yourself, explaining to each other, explaining to the room. For each of these ones, they had to develop some kind of like drawing or schematic on whiteboards to show the room. That leverages all of these additional skills, right? So if you sit in the room and listen to me talk about nanobodies, if you're motivated, you probably come away thinking, oh, those are cool, right? But if you have to stand in front of your peers and explain something about nanobodies, maybe answer a few questions from the people in the room, that's a different level of motivation, right? You go from relax, checking your email, shopping on Amazon, to like fully engaged, right? Really, and I tend to put them in small groups. It's hard for them to hide, so groups of like 4. So it's really about leveraging aspects of the social interaction that make the learning more salient, right? That when I interact with you as my peer, I get a chance to listen, explain, clarify, and do all of that in real time. And there's like much deeper learning that's going to happen than if I listen to someone else do all the work.
I agree, because in that case, if I were to just go home and learn the material that I was lectured and then come back the next day and learn some more, like you said, I'm just relaxed. I'm not really maybe even motivated to learn that day. I might say, oh, I'll leave it to next week. I'm doing something else today. But if I have the expectation that I'm coming tomorrow to teach other people, I'm a lot more maybe anxious, and I would want to be more prepared so I don't embarrass myself. And just those alone would force me to want to read upon the information more. And I actually might get more interested in it because I have to teach other people now. And so as I stand in front of the class, I actually learn better. I find that myself, even when I'm studying for something that doesn't have to do with like worksheets or anything like that, I'm trying to explain something to my partner, I get a bit more enthusiastic about it. And I tend to retain that information a lot better that I explained it to somebody else.
Yeah, because when you explain it to somebody else, right, you have to build those ideas in your own head. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but the neuroscience tell me, right, when those two cells shoot, when they send signals across the synapse from one to the other, you build stronger connections between neurons that are during that connection, right? You can build this stronger understanding if you do it inside your own head. And the only way to do that is to engage with the content. And I would say, I mean, I don't ever want, like, I don't want to overly leverage anxiety, right? Because then some people might be too frightened to contribute or to answer questions. So I try to ease them in. And one of the ways is to start with, right? Just talk to your neighbor. And you don't have to tell us what you talked about, but talk to your neighbor about the problem, and then move up to talk to the other people at the table, and then pick someone from the table to answer the question. So we can like kind of slowly move up to a place of stand in front of the room and talk to everybody. But last year in particular, because I taught the course completely online for 2 years. So last September 22, I could really see an improvement. The first time that people stand up, many of them do a really poor job, right? Because they're really, really nervous. But if you give them a chance to stand up and explain a couple of times through the semester, by the end of the semester, when they're now doing it for grades and they're giving a presentation, they're way better, way better. And that's something we want them to learn how to do, right?
They become a lot more confident.
Yes. Yeah. The other thing, George, is that biology is so vocabulary heavy. There's so many new words that they need practice, like speaking the language of biology. And they can't get that if I'm the only one who talks.
That's very true, because having taking an exam or taking a quiz doesn't really strengthen that vocabulary connection. You actually have to be talking it amongst your peers, and which we probably don't normally do in a regular auditorium setting.
No, but so even in the big classes, I don't have them work like in small groups on case studies, but I do have them work on problems together. So we do work on worksheets in the big class, like in micro or plants, or we do like they're called clicker style questions, like a poll everywhere question where you see the question, then you vote. And then we've even done some 2-stage testing in those classes as a review tool. So we had like 10 multiple choice questions. They're like 10 big concepts that are going to be in the midterms later in the week. Come into class, answer those questions, pass those in, and then do the test again, but now with 3 or 4 other people with the little scratch cards. And the scratch cards are fun because when you scratch, you get a star and you know you got it right. And our data suggests that helps them get ready for the midterm because they get real information real time, right? Like, I thought I understood that mechanism or that pathway or whatever the topic is, but I got that wrong on the review questions. So, but now I know that. But if you and I are working in the test together, you don't know I got it wrong the first time. I'm the only one who knows that. But I can take that information home with me to study. So you can use these techniques in big classes and in small classes. It's just kind of the way you do it, that what people call the orchestration is a little bit different in the bigger classes, but it definitely works in the big classes.
Do you think that there are certain courses or material that you cannot teach in that way because of the nature of how difficult it is to teach some complex topic?
No.
For anything. Can you do it for mathematics?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, physics.
Yeah.
Organic chemistry seems like it might be a bit difficult to apply to because it's all mechanisms and reactions.
Yeah. But imagine, like, let's say in organic chemistry, imagine if the walls were whiteboards.
Okay.
And, you know, the first 10 minutes, the prof puts up 3 hard mechanism questions, and everybody goes to a whiteboard with some markers with a group of 3 or 4 and figure it out.
And you can work in groups. You don't have to do it by yourself.
You work in groups. You don't have to do it by yourself. And then, you know, one group explains the mechanism they came up with. And I would say, actually, you could have, you know, one group explains the mechanism. Maybe even you put up a problem where you know there's more than one possible answer. Like, that would be a great question.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's really hard. And it's especially hard if you bring that mindset that I need to memorize everything into the course. And then if someone, like, you know, helps you to realize there's more than one way to answer this problem, there's more than one way to deal with this question, there's some really cool learning that could happen. So yeah, I think every single thing could be taught this way. It can be. Like, there is a body of literature that exists that has looked at undergraduate teaching, and it's really unambiguous that learning requires practice and supported practice, so with other people, and that's the best way to help students to learn things.
You've convinced me, yeah, because as soon as you gave that example, I realized that, yeah, I could get up there and try to figure something out. If I don't, maybe someone comes in and say, hey, you might be able to think of it from this angle. And then, yeah, it popped that you're right. You could definitely have active learning for probably anything.
Yeah. It's a funny thing about learning is that because it feels like it all happens in our heads, we have a different way of thinking about it than other kinds of learning. But if you think about, like, learning to throw a ball or ride a bicycle, and I always ask my students is, like, how many people in the room know how to ride a bicycle? Most people put their hands up, right? And I'll say, wow, look at that. Such a talented group. It's awesome. And then I'll ask them, how many people in this room have gone to a series of great lectures about how to ride a bike?
Nobody puts their hand up.
Nobody puts their hands up. And then, like, why wouldn't that work? It wouldn't work because you have to sit in the bike. You have to feel the balance. You have to figure out the brakes. You have to figure out the steering, right? You have to do that with your body and your brain, right? You're doing, like, both of these things are working together. But that's true about how to throw a ball, how to catch a ball, how to hit something with a tennis racket, how to drive a car, right? We have to do the thing in order to become experts or be even just competent at doing the thing, right? And that is true for biology. That's true for math. It's true for reading. It's just true for human learning that we need to spend time doing the thing. And the active learning, one of the big ideas is that rather than, so in an older style model, right? Like the way I did my undergrad, you go to class, you listen to someone else talk, and then you come home and you do the hard work now all by yourself, right? The questions, the problems, the homework, the assignment, you don't have any help. But if instead in class where there are people, the people who sit next to you and the TAs and the professor, if you're working on the hard problems in class where you can get help, where you can get support, where you can figure out, oh, I don't really understand how that works, and find out in real time before the final exam or the midterm, then what you can do is help the student to use that time to do the things that we know are really well aligned with learning.
That's very interesting because you seem to have developed very different approaches to learning and teaching mainly than perhaps other professors have. And I had brought a point up earlier about education and that grade 1 to grade 12 educators have to go to special school in order to learn how to teach. How come professors don't have to do that? Because they're teaching arguably even more complex courses and to a larger audience that is supposed to figure out how to really comprehend that material. And it's even more challenging because once you get into the first year, you're consumed by having to meet new people and want to party and want to really experience that university life. But then it might be even more difficult for you to sit down, focus, and really understand, especially that you don't know maybe how to learn. You haven't perhaps figured out the way that you most optimally learn. So why aren't professors learning how to teach?
I mean, it's not part of the tradition of how the university is run. The university is run on a really old-fashioned model, really, really old-fashioned, right? So that there's not a lot of access to the information. There's fewer books. Maybe there's not enough books for everybody. There's fewer people who have access to the books and the reading and the knowledge. And those people are going to transmit the knowledge, right, from their head to other people's heads. That's a very old-fashioned model. And it's not the modern context, because now what we have is an abundance of information, and arguably the skills are quite different, right? We want people to make predictions, to interpret data, to design a new way of doing something, rather than memorize the name of an enzyme or the structure of an intermediate in a pathway or something like that. So first is that universities are old-fashioned places that are slow to change. It's probably the simplest possible answer.
Don't get me wrong. I don't think that all professors aren't good at teaching. I think that a lot of them actually come in with very exciting and great abilities to take a topic and try to explain it in different ways to students. But I'm just kind of curious as to why such a system isn't present for both teaching levels.
Yeah. There is definitely training on campus for people who want to seek it out. So the teaching and learning services here at Carleton, they have several really great programs. One is a certificate in university teaching program. And then they have workshops. So if you wanted to learn various different, I've given some talks or answer questions or interact with people in a workshop kind of setting. So it's very motivated people typically who would find out. It's not the only part of the job, right? For me, because I'm an instructor, it's 75% of my job description involves teaching and interacting with students. But for my colleagues who are researchers, it's closer to 40%. So they have all these other things, so including their research, right? Which really occupies their time and is a kind of teaching. There's no question about that, right? Because teaching your grad students, reading papers, supporting them, helping them design experiments, helping them think about the data that they get back, how to present it all, how to make sense of it, all of that kind of stuff. It's teaching. It's a different scale of teaching, but it's definitely really important teaching. So those are probably some of the reasons. Yeah, people can get some training if they seek it out, but it's not typically a requirement. Although I would say, more and more, I can say just from having been on some hiring committees, that ideally we would see people who, especially applying for a job at Carleton, which is a comprehensive university, which means that we're supposed to sort of value teaching and research equally, that these are equally weighted activities on our campus. Ideally, applicants will have had some experience with teaching, but they might not have had tons. I think one solution, to be honest, is to to do more training of grad students. So a grad student who wants to know about teaching, good for us to have more courses where they could learn about teaching. And I teach one of those courses. So I've tried to put my money where my mouth is on this stuff. But yeah, once people start into the professor role, it's hard for them they already have so many things that they're doing and trying to pay attention to. Adding in like additional components, like, you just got the job, you have to write grants, maybe recruit students, get ready to teach, and learn some more things about teaching. It might almost be like getting a little bit too late for that person because they're trying to get started in the job.
That's also a good point. It's probably something that I overlooked because they're not just teaching, they're doing research and they're writing grants. They're perhaps reviewing other people's papers. Yeah. They have a lot on their plate. Yeah. And so perhaps doing one more thing in that they're trying to learn how to teach might be just adding too much to what they already do. One thing though I wanted to mention is there are practical courses, which are basically lab run courses. And one of the lab coordinators had designed a type of learning experience where the whole course was basically just a lab, but in one of the assignments, you had to design your own experiment. You had to isolate a protein and you had to write a paper about how you're going to go by doing that. And from scratch, essentially figuring out, the weight of the protein. How do you isolate it? What do you use? How many reagents do you need? You got to go through listing the expenses, and you got to go through figuring out where are you buying these from. And just to put you in the perspective of what a researcher is doing as an undergraduate and how you can really run through a research protocol by designing it yourself, which I thought was really interesting. And it was a lot more challenging than I expected because as undergrad students, we're normally just following a protocol and then analyzing the results. Oh, this is what we expect. This is what we got. Yeah. Write it up. But when you have to design something from scratch, it's much more difficult than it sounds.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good example of active learning, right? Because if you choose the protein yourself and then you have to do all the hard thinking of no protocol, how do you come up with it? That's harder to do than to follow the steps of a protocol.
Now, one thing I wanted to get into was you had mentioned that you were teaching in the last 2-3 years as well, which was during the pandemic. So I imagine that there was a difference in the way that students were learning and engaging amongst themselves before, during, and after the pandemic. So how did you notice the learning shifted when you were in an online format? Were they interacting with each other as much? Was there communication? Was there that active learning style that you had when classes were in person?
So I tried really hard to still have some active learning in all of my courses. But I would say, especially in the fall of 2021, I think that's when Steph and I were really noticing in biotech, their social skills were really poor and they were not good at communicating with each other. So they would ghost each other, which is not good. And they would do things like, this is one of my favorite examples, this group wrote to me to say, we're having problems with our group. This group member has not responded to us. We want to record our presentation, because they had the option to either record the presentation or present it live on Zoom. So we want to record, but she hasn't come to our online meeting to do the recording. And it turned out that she was asleep in Kuwait. And they had not gotten to know each other well enough to know that she was in Kuwait, which I found really shocking. Like, it just seems so callous of them. Like, we sent her the message and she didn't respond. She's out. And I was like, oh, okay. But now we find out that it was like 3 o'clock in the morning where she was. So of course she didn't respond to you. So that's probably one of the things I noticed a lot, kind of a callous way of interacting with each other. And so my TAs and I, in that course, and then in the course in the following winter, started talking to them more about how to interact with other people, which is I've never really had talks with my students about how, I mean, a little bit, but not about like, turn your camera on, make eye contact, interact with other people, like really, really basic things. And that started to concern me. And I think it just has a lot to do with, you know, a disconnected way of being that we had during the pandemic, or we were like really connected to our hyper local people, right? The people we lived with, but then maybe anybody else, we're just not connecting well with them, and losing some of the social skills of like acknowledging the other person, asking a question like, where do you live? Really, really basic kind of stuff. And after we saw that happen in the fall and then in the winter of 2022, like early January, in the fourth year course in particular, because they work on they're building their companies for the whole semester. And basically it's a group project for the whole semester. We spent 2 3-hour class sessions talking about how to treat other people. Like scenarios, writing up contracts, talking about, you know, can you fire someone from your company? Why not? What are the consequences? What are we going to do with people who don't contribute? How are we going to treat each other with kindness in terms of like, you know, sometimes the person can't show up. So how do we just kind of give them some grace, but also, you know, hold people to account when need be? And yeah, I've never had those kind of conversations. Maybe I should have been having them. It's interesting, even like in January of 2023, so we're back in person in the fourth year course. We had the first round of pitches. So there's like 3 pitch sessions in that course. So the first pitch, there were 2 business people who came, asked some smart questions, 2 colleagues of mine, one from biology, one from Sprott. The next day, we're just kind of rehashing how'd it go. And the way that we work is that they're sitting in their little groups. So I would go and talk to like company number 1 and find out how they're doing. Go talk to company number 2. Company number 1, a young woman in that group says, I didn't like the way that people ask questions. I said, okay. I don't understand. What do you mean? She said they were mean. I don't like the way they ask those mean questions. And then I'm thinking about my colleagues, right? I'm thinking like, oh, they were intimidated by my 2 colleagues. I said, do you mean like the 2 professors who were here? No, those guys were fine. It's the rest of the people in the class. I don't like the way they ask questions. And I was in the room, right? Like I think I would have noticed if people were unkind or cutting each other down or something, right? I was like, I didn't see anything. So, but you never know, right? There could be one person who notices something and maybe others don't agree. So I asked the next group, how'd it go? And I said, you know, some people didn't really like the way the questions were being asked. What do you think? Oh yeah, totally agree. Oh, the other people in the class are our peers, are being rude.
Interesting. So it's a prevailing.
Yeah. So then I was like, okay, we need to have a class discussion about rude questions and like constructive ways to give criticism, but also ways to receive criticism and feedback. So we had this whole conversation about like, what does it look like, feel like, sound like to get a question that's hard or tough about your ideas? People are asking questions about your ideas, not about you as a person. And then how can we receive feedback from another person that doesn't make us like we don't feel like it's an attack on us as a person? And what's interesting about that to me was that most of them seemed to agree that it had been a harsh session and I hadn't noticed. And I think that there's like real subtlety. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm just my observations, but there must be some like really subtle human interaction kinds of things that we learn in our early 20s that maybe they hadn't had a chance to interact with. getting that kind of tough question from your professor, or maybe having your first breakup, or you're having a hard conversation with your landlord. Like maybe some of that stuff hadn't happened for them because of the pandemic, and there's often staying at home and being kind of in that protected bubble in the family home, and maybe not a lot of experience like with wider interactions with other people. So I found that was very interesting.
That's an interesting point. Even earlier when you were mentioning that amongst themselves as they are either presenting, or, for example, when that group wasn't having the presentation with the other person from Kuwait, something that I find I've experienced myself during that time was that people tend to be a little bit more courageous to say things online than they would in person. And perhaps when you're in class, you interact with others and you develop this, you see who that person is. You put a face to the name and to the voice, and you don't really do that online or over Zoom, especially because, like you said, people don't turn on their cameras. So to them, it's just some other voice, if people even talk in class. And then when you come to, having any problems that people are not really good at communicating with each other, it tends to come up as, you don't know that person. You've never interacted with them. And perhaps if it was in person, you wouldn't tell them a certain thing, or you would be more open to communicating with them because you know that person. You've met with them, you've interacted with them. Maybe you gave them some help on their homework. You've lent them a pencil. You've had an interaction. The problem with it is that, online, I have almost not met a lot of people that I could have met during my 3rd and 4th year because of the pandemic. Like you said, I'm also not a psychologist, so I don't know how that affects people, but I think it plays into the way they behave amongst each other when they're, learning the whole time online versus in person.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think it's like small, subtle ways that we have of interacting with each other. Probably a lot of young people just need a little bit more time to, have a wider life experiences and learn how to interact in these subtle kind of ways with each other.
Also, to be fair to everyone, a lot of the time, if you're communicating during the pandemic over text, certain nuances to the words you're trying to say don't carry over in text. So people might perceive you saying something and they might perceive it as, you're being passive aggressive, but really you never meant to be passive aggressive. And so if you were communicating that in person, it would have been fine. They would have received it well. And that kind of perhaps something that we don't really see over text wouldn't have been transferred in real life, like when you're talking in face to the person.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah. Now, one thing you were mentioning is the 4th year biotech course, and something I hadn't gone into, but I wanted to bring up because while I did learn it during the pandemic, it was fascinating because it was the first, there was no exams. I think students tend to love when there's no final exam. It's fantastic. But I still came out learning a lot from that course because it was, you know what? Could you tell us how it was? I just want you to explain how the course is set up.
So the idea with the course is to imagine the students in a biotech incubator, and that they start a biotech startup company and go through the first stages of starting that company. And so it's a term-long project and a group project. You can't really do that by yourself. It's too hard. In the last couple of years, I've done like these kind of public brainstorming sessions where trying to get students to, rather than choose someone that they know to work with, which could be good in some cases, but not necessarily, try to choose an idea to work on and with other people. And then they develop that idea, and we learn about sort of IP through the lens of their idea. And then we learn about how to get the business funded and how to write grants and get money and pitch for money only through the lens of their company. And then because it's a science course, they have to sort of really flesh out the science and explain how the science works, and then sort of pitch their idea to a panel of scientists who are in the room. And then at the very end, we have a dragon's den, and each company pitches their idea to the panel. So we have this vision of the incubator. During the incubator periods, which is like 3 hours a week, usually we have somebody from the exterior world to join our class and tell us about the work that they're doing. And then students, the idea is kind of like, now we have an intellectual property expert who's come to talk to us. And so ask questions that would help your company. Or now we have somebody who's worked in good laboratory practice or clean manufacturing practices. And so we're going to ask that person questions from that perspective. It's really fun. I love the course.
Yeah, it was a really good course, especially because we weren't expected to just, make something up. And, I'm a company that I make these nanobots that go in and target cancer and they kill the cancer. If that's what I'm claiming, I have to prove it by science that it's, that there's literature that backs this up. I'm not just making some random company that, it's just because for fun. No, you were serious about it having to have actual application and real evidence that this thing has been proven, or there's a proof of concept that this works.
Yeah. People find that part hard.
It really is, because it removes that imaginative part where, I can just say that it does this and say that it does that, and I don't need to back it up. Yeah. But you really need to back it up.
Yeah. But do you remember there's a class that's about like, why does the science matter?
Yes.
We talked about Theranos and that company that's supposed to extend your chromosomes, make you younger, as a point of crap science is not good for anybody.
True. And
it's really important as scientists to be able to, have the spidey senses to say like that sounds like BS. I don't buy that.
Yeah.
Or, if somebody has an amazing claim to be able to look at the data and say, okay, that's kind of an outstanding claim, but maybe you can back it up with some convincing data. I think that's an important part of the course being a science course, is that students kind of assess, right? That doesn't really seem like a reasonable idea, and then kindly ask their peers whether or not that's based on something real.
Yeah, that was a fantastic course. Some final closing thoughts. What's your trajectory currently in the research that you're interested in doing? Are you looking for new ways of teaching? Are you trying to, because you're on your sabbatical right now, right?
I am.
Have you planned out yet what you wanted to do, and if you're trying to learn new things?
I have two main big projects. One is to rejig one of our second-year foundational courses that I have never taught before. So I'm excited about that.
What's the course?
The course is genetics.
Ooh, that's not an easy topic.
No, it's a really hard topic for most students, and it's a big class. And so, I think this will be an exciting challenge for me to take that one on and to try to incorporate more of these active learning approaches to support students to learning that content. And then the other thing is I have become really interested in the equity, diversity, and inclusion in science and in science education. And we know that active learning works for everybody, right? In fact, some of the early work by Freeman and his colleagues, they demonstrate in a meta-analysis that across disciplines, across institutions, you see a general impact of reduced failure rates, which then turn into increased retention rates, right? Because if you fail first-year biology, then you probably don't take the next course, right? Whereas if you pass, you're more likely to take the second-year course, right?
Makes sense.
So it's interesting because you actually want to reduce failure so that more people will stay and get a chance to, take that time that was required to find their footing, figure out their studying practices that will help them to do well and continue and start to feel like they're really part of the science program. So we know that active learning reduces failure, increases retention. And some subsequent work has shown actually that active learning disproportionately benefits students who've been historically excluded from the sciences. And those people are, I like to say, those people are the majority of humanity. Women, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ, members of the LGBTQ community. Those people have been like systematically excluded from science, right, historically. And they disproportionately do even better. So they're even less likely to fail when we use these active learning approaches. So I'm really interested in like leveraging active learning as a way to make science more inclusive. Because I think the literature is clear that when we use these practices, we will get more diverse people being able to persist in science. There are many reasons that a person from a historically excluded group will maybe start to believe that they don't belong in science. One of them would be if they fail the course, right? Then they're like, okay, well,
this is not for me.
This is not for me. I just failed. But there are other subtler messages, right? Like if you go to class and the person at the front of the room never looks like you. If you look around in the room and nobody else in the room looks like you. If you look on the campus, on the faculty website page and you see nobody who looks like you, right? There is this message about who belongs in science. So I think I'm really interested in like finding ways to make science more inclusive. I think that in a lot of ways, historically, people who've been teaching science have acted like bouncers, that their role is to keep other people out. You're not the kind who succeeds here, and you're not the kind. But I don't see that as a role for me. Like the role for me, I think, is actually to be like the party planner, to welcome people into science. The content is challenging, right? The depth of details, understanding how the process works, understanding the pathway. I can't really make that stuff easy, but I can change the climate of the classroom, and I can use strategies in my teaching that I know help more people to learn, and then increase the likelihood that a person they stay in science long enough that they maybe start to see themselves or people like them, or they start to feel like, oh, even a person like me can fit here. So that's what my current research interests are about.
That's awesome. Facilitate an environment where science becomes a lot more enjoyable to pursue.
Yeah. It should be a joyful undertaking.
it should be, for sure. And the more people we can get into science, the more brain power we have working on science, the more likely we are to make breakthroughs over time.
Absolutely. And there's countless really interesting examples across science, right? If you only have a subsection of the population thinking about an important problem, you just can't bring the same sort of breadth of problem solving to that problem, right? Whereas if you bring people who have a variety of lived experiences, I think there's a greater chance we find the solutions to really big problems by diversifying science.
Very well said. Last closing question. Who is your scientist, if you have one, that inspired you and that you looked up to, perhaps growing up, and why?
Well, I feel like my answer to this question is Jane Goodall.
Okay.
Yeah. But I didn't read very much about Jane Goodall until I was in my 20s. I read her first book, and I just found it really, really striking. And the thing that there's lots of things about her, like, her ability to translate her work into like worldwide impact is really remarkable. But the thing I really like about her way of thinking about science is that she did something pretty simple, but actually pretty complex. She's just like sat in the woods and watched the organisms that she was interested in. And then she saw things that nobody else had seen because she just sat there and watched. I think there's a really cool message in there for somebody like me, because my students stay young and I get older and older, right? And so for me to understand my students, I have to watch, listen, ask them questions, respond to their feedback so that I can, have a classroom that's inclusive, have a classroom that's responsive, have a classroom that's welcoming. So I need to make those observations of my specimen, right, in the same way that Jean Goodall did.
Yeah.
And so I find that idea really inspiring.
That's amazing. All right. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and thank you for doing this. I hope that we can have further discussions in the future. Best of luck with everything, all the work that you're going to be doing during your sabbatical, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, George. This was such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening, everyone.